Hello, everybody. We'll get started in just a moment here. I just want to make sure people just joining right now have a chance to get their audio settled. Seems like a good critical mass, and I'll make sure that this is typed out in the chat, but we'll cover it again a bit later on. Welcome to today's webinar. Before we get started, I just want to cover a few technical details. If you haven't joined us for one of these before, we use Zoom Webinar, not Zoom Meeting. They are very similar, but there are a couple key differences. The first, which you probably already noticed, is that your cameras and microphones are disabled by default. So you don't have to worry about interrupting us, but that does mean that your options for interacting are limited to chat effectively or Q&A. So with chat, if you want everyone to see your message for discussion or comment, make sure that you put everyone in the drop-down menu there. Otherwise, only the hosts and panelists will see it. If you have a question related to the content being presented, we ask that you put that in the Q&A just because it makes it easier for us to manage that when we get to it. You can ask questions anonymously, and you can view existing questions, upvote them, and even add your own comments to them. So without further ado, I want to hand it off to Tom Green. Tom?
Thanks, Mike. Happy Friday, everybody. So glad that you could join us today for this webinar. We're really looking forward to sharing the content with you and also to receiving your questions and comments today. I want to first introduce my co-presenter, Kimberley Buster-Williams.
Hello, everyone. I'm Kimberley Buster-Williams, and I currently serve as the Vice President for Enrollment Management at the University of Mary Washington in Fredericksburg, Virginia. And I also serve as the Assistant Director of the SEM EP program, ACRO's SEM endorsement program. So happy Friday.
And I'm Tom Green. I'm the Associate Executive Director at ACRO. I oversee our consulting division, but also strategic enrollment management initiatives for the association, which includes our SEM conference coming up in November, SEM quarterly, and webinars and other resources like this that we're presenting today. So just a note, Mike already let you know that you're disabled by default with your mics, and we may ask you to unmute or ask a question at the end there. But that just makes sure that if there's any background noise, any unintended dog barking or lawn mowing that happens outside your window today, that doesn't disturb the other participants from hearing us today. The Q&A box, we're really looking forward to your questions. Please drop those in at any time. We really welcome those, and we've allotted some time at the end of this for those as well. And the chat stream. So you want to make sure that you're creating that conversation on the side. One of the things we've learned to do in these webinars is not only have this conversation that's going on screen, but the conversation on the side too in the chat, which is really kind of fun and interesting, different way to connect with us and with your other participants in this webinar. So, given that, we've got a four-pronged approach here. We want to talk about how we got here. We want to talk about climate for diversity at your institution and for your students. And then we want to really look at this from the SEM lenses of access or the input, the students coming to the institution, and then also the throughput, the success of students at your institution. So we're going to talk about equity gaps from both of those lenses of SEM. And then, of course, as I mentioned, time for some Q&A and discussion at the end of the hour. So with that, Kimberly, would you mind doing the next section, please?
Sure, absolutely. So it's certainly, I think, appropriate to start and to really look at how did we get here, kind of inequity over time. So I'm going to share a few slides and give some background information. If any of you all know me, you know I'm a bit of a history buff. So if you can just, we don't have enough time, but certainly I think providing some context is helpful. So I thought it was important to talk a little bit about the 19th and 20th century in terms of illiteracy and poverty. And I think we can look at two specific historical events that kind of explain some of what we see today: chattel slavery and then the treatment of Native American Indians. And so briefly, our chattel slavery existed from our founding in 1776 until the passage of the 13th Amendment in 1865. 22 years after that, the Dawes Act was passed. And so again, lots of information here, but the takeaway is that, going back to our early days in terms of our founding, there are some things that have had a lingering impact. And those are two that I wanted to briefly touch on. As you can see on the last bullet, American Indians and Alaska Native comprised 1.1% of the total college and university enrollments in 2006. And that's increased a little bit over time. So again, just to provide a little historical context. Relatedly, 5 years after the 13th Amendment was passed, you can see that about 20% of the entire adult population was illiterate, and 80% of the Black population was illiterate. And so again, over time, this has improved, but again, certainly important for everyone to have some context in terms of how these things have impacted higher education, really going back some time.
And Kimberly, it's just amazing to think of the time span there of how many years it took, essentially over 100 years,
Yes.
to close one equity gap on literacy.
Yes.
That's an amazing historical perspective.
Yes, yes. Yeah. And so kind of related in terms of how long these things have taken, 118 years after that 13th Amendment was enacted, this report came out called The Nation at Risk, and it came out in 1983. And if you remember, this particular report really talked about the state of affairs in terms of education in the US. It lifted up failing schools. It talked about being outcompeted internationally, and really just a decline in educational standards. And so that particular report, I think, kind of was the initial movement in terms of some follow-up reports that we see, the No Child Left Behind law in 2002, and then the Race to the Top initiative in 2009. And so again, to Tom's point, this was 118 years after that 13th Amendment was passed, we have this 1983 report entitled The Nation at Risk. So my last little historical nugget, because trust me, I could spend a whole session just on these historical pieces, and I get really excited about it. But this particular report was written in 1999, and it's called Answers in the Toolbox. And it really started to look at, this particular researcher looked at variables that predicted the bachelor's degree attainment. And so the two things that he pointed to were academic resources and then continuous improvement once a student made a true start in college. And so again, we moved from the Nation at Risk report to then moving forward to trying to identify some key variables related to degree completion.
Great. So now we've had our first of the four prongs. We've understood the context for equity gaps and how some of those were created, but also the amazing length of time it's taken to even close a simple one of those issues, literacy. So let's look at our second prong, which is climate. And this is often an under-examined issue. And when we think about this, we think about a couple of things with this. One is that, is your institution known for, do you have a reputation for, are you a place that's welcoming to underrepresented student groups? So how comfortable do students feel when they come to your campus? Do they feel like this is a place that's really easy, that the transition is an easy one, or do they face additional hurdles and obstacles because of their underrepresented status on your campus? The second is to think about representation, and that matters. It is important that they see themselves in your recruiting staff. Does the staff of your institution who recruit students, the public face, if you will, going out there into college fairs, high school visits, community college sessions, are those folks who are doing that representative of the students you have today and the student body that you want to have in the future? And will students who then come to your campus for a visit or to enroll see themselves among your faculty, the student life personnel, the administration, the staff with it? That's an important aspect of this to really think about as you start to examine it. Now, obviously, for the enrollment manager, there's a scope of control aspect of this. You don't hire all the faculty of the institution. You don't hire all the administrators and staff. But you do often are in charge of hiring your recruitment staff and the people who work in your offices. And so you do have an ability to influence that and to start to create change of representation so that when your prospective students consider attending your institution, they see themselves in the people they're meeting there, and they know, at least at the very front part of that, the very beginning step, that this is a place that they may feel like they could fit and be comfortable. So when we think about the climate dimensions, I think there are four really important lenses through which we need to look at climate. And so the first of those is between the learner and the faculty. So that's where most students are going to spend their time. They're going to be interacting with your faculty in classes. So that's really important. What's the climate? How are faculty speaking to students of color? How is the curriculum inclusive for students of color, for LGBTQ+, for low SES students? Are there assumptions made about resources and family background that are happening in that classroom that can either foster a sense of belonging or inhibit a sense of belonging? The second is their relationship to other students. So what's the social climate like? And of course, just the critical mass or numbers of students of color you may have on your campus is a physical or visual representation of that. But it's also just the climate of really, are they going to be asked uncomfortable questions about their background? Are there assumptions being made by other students? How easy or difficult is it for them? And remember, some of your students who are coming to campus have come from schools where virtually everyone in that school looked like them or was from their same social group, and now they're coming to a place where they may be one of very few or not at that. But that's another dimension. You need to examine that climate for diversity, welcoming, and inclusiveness. Now, the third, of course, are staff and administration. And while students hopefully don't have to spend an inordinate amount of time dealing with staff and administration, certainly they're going to have interactions with them. And you want those to be really positive and really reinforcing of being very welcoming and very inclusive. The last dimension I want to mention here is probably the one that gets overlooked the most, and that is with the external community. You can do these other three things really, really well. And in fact, I've been on campuses where those three things are just really way above average, just excellent job with that. And the moment the student steps foot off campus into town, everything's different. And they just aren't welcome. There may even be comments made. There may be strange looks. They may be followed in stores. And that can kill it. So, you can do all of these other things right, and that one can be the thing that can really hang it up. Before we move on to our next prong with that, Kimberly, did you have anything you wanted to add about climate?
Yeah, I think I agree with everything. And I think the only point I would kind of follow up in terms of that external community where I've seen really some positive work is when our campus safety, our campus police work with policing around the town. And so again, there are opportunities to really reach out and collaborate. And in that particular area, I think I've seen great success with those safety areas, the police on campus and the community kind of really working together collaboratively to create a positive environment for students.
Oh, what a great point. I also want to point out that at the end of the slide deck, there are resources, and we have some resources on where to look for climate studies or resources about climate studies for your campus. If you're not quite sure what kind of resources you may need or what's available, those are some places we've inserted into the deck for you that you'll have at the end of the webinar today. Okay, so let's then look at our first lens of SEM, which is really thinking about recruitment and access and how students are coming to the institution. That involves marketing, all kinds of things that you're paying attention to when you're trying to really build the class and recruit the students you want to have at your college or university. So the first of those I want to speak to is dual enrollment. And this is not one that we would often put in the category of, what do you mean? Closing equity gaps. What's dual enrollment have to do with this? But dual enrollment has become so popular today in American higher education that it's certainly deserving of some attention here. And if you really start to examine it, it can be an area that is really rife with issues of equity. So one of the ways that this happens is that many dual enrollment programs operate in a way where they certify the course or credential a high school course, which is typically an advanced level, with an advanced level instructor. So the curriculum needs to be something, think AP, think IB, right? Think of those type of courses. Those are kind of lending themselves towards dual enrollment certification, but also teachers with at least a master's degree in the field of study. And so not just an MSED, but actually a master's degree in biology. And when we start to think about the schools that have those kind of resources, what we begin to see is that we're favoring the advantaged students. We're favoring the advantaged schools already, because these types of arrangements with high schools are easiest to make with those schools that already have all the advantages. And so we're creating an inequity by providing college credit in the high school to the students who may need it the least and may already have advantages they're benefiting from. It just reinforces that advantage with it. And then we think about fees, and most of the dual enrollment programs I've worked with have really modest fees. I mean, pretty low tuition for most dual enrollment programs. But if you think about a family that's very low income, even a modest fee, $100 can be a deal breaker for a family that's living under the poverty line. And so if you're thinking about the structure of these, and maybe you're an institution that charges $1,000 or more a credit hour, and you're offering something for $100 a credit hour, and you're thinking, what a bargain. But for that low income family, that is inaccessible. They cannot possibly raise the funds for that. So it becomes a barrier for them. And so you need to think about the fees you're charging for dual enrollment as something that could be reinforcing inequity in that system. So some questions. Where are you offering dual enrollment? Examine those schools, examine the socioeconomic levels of those schools. A really quick indicator of socioeconomic status in the high school is the free and reduced lunch program. And so look at the percent of students in that high school on free and reduced lunch, and you'll know kind of what the share is. If you begin to examine the high schools in your market area, you'll begin to see which are the schools that have really higher incomes and which are the schools that really serve lower income students. And that should be a signal to you that if you're only offering your programs in those high SES schools, you're really shutting out opportunity for college credit to those lower income programs. And then you've got to be creative and think, well, how could we offer programs for these schools that can't certify a course? Maybe that's through distance education. Maybe it's being able to bring students on your campus. I know several colleges and universities that have more of an early college model that will send the faculty member out to that high school to teach a course, especially if they don't have a full load that semester, that they might make up that load by teaching a course at the high school. So there are creative ways to do it, but you have to be intentional and you have to be really looking and observing whether or not you might be favoring advantage or really helping to erase disadvantage.
Hey, Tom.
Yeah.
I would just add, and I do think that it is important, especially with the dual enrollment and the percent of students on free and reduced lunch, to review those data periodically, because schools shift. And so schools that perhaps historically have fallen in that category sometimes are not in that category, and vice versa. And so I have found that even here in the state of Virginia, that just kind of relying on historical knowledge about a particular school or particular school districts, it's always good to double check, because from time to time there are shifts that you certainly want to make sure that you're not just going on off of historical assumptions about school districts.
What a great point. Yeah, it's great. Thanks, Kimberly. As I previously mentioned, staff representation matters, and so this is where you can have some scope of control with it. And it's often in our recruiting offices, we have a lot of turnover. I mean, that's always been true as long as I've been in the profession. And so that's an opportunity. As you have new staff hiring, if you've got qualified candidates who are people of color, bringing them into your staff is a real opportunity for you not only to get those folks on your career track and get them going in the admissions profession, but also it's an opportunity to really show the community and show the schools that you serve and the students that you serve, the families that you serve, that representation matters to you. And so this is a really important part. It's been something over all the years I've been doing it at every school where I've worked. I've always seen that opportunity and tried to make sure that we were using it, not as a way just to, oh my gosh, it's August. Who can we get? We need somebody to be out on the road right away. But this is an opportunity to make sure that we, can diversify the staff and make sure that it really looks like the student body we want to have, and certainly the student body that we do have today. Another very important part of that is cultural competence training. And I believe Michelle Sandlin said this at one point, every year you should be doing this, right? This is not just a one and done and forget it for the next decade. This should be ingrained into your training every year for recruiting. And so it's not only important for your recruiting staff, but also your frontline staff, all your staff, but especially anyone who's going to be interacting with students, because I think oftentimes we don't realize some of the things we might say or do could be really perceived in a negative way, and it might not be intentional that people are doing that. In fact, I believe most of the time it's unintentional, but still harmful. And so we need to make sure that everybody is highly aware and has a very high level of cultural competence. And Kimberly, would you talk a little bit more about just what we mean by that?
Yeah, absolutely. And so I think, in a nutshell, cultural competency is the ability to effectively provide services cross-culturally. And it's a set of congruent behaviors, attitudes, policies, and things that kind of come together. And it really allows professionals in that sense to work effectively in cross-cultural situations. I wanted to just highlight a few synonyms. Again, we talk about cultural competence, but you may also hear this referred to as ethnic sensitive practice, cross-cultural awareness practice, ethics, ethnic competence, ethnic minority practice, and more. I'm getting tongue twisted here. So, but all of those things, all of those variations kind of fall under that umbrella of cultural competence. And I do think that, you want to move towards cultural competence. And so to Tom's point about annual training, that's so critically important, because you must make sure the staff, again, have self-awareness, that they have knowledge of prospective students, the various cultures, and that they're able to adapt and understand that they have to have an adaptation of skills. And so those are critical things that pertain to cultural competence. Now, I know in the chat, there was a question about resources. And so there's some resources at the end of this slide, but I will point out that Diller's book that I referenced here on this slide, it may be a good one to take a look at, and there are others, but it's critical. It's a critically important piece.
Yeah, and Kimberly, I just wanted to add that on the annual training piece, or the regular training, right, ongoing, I think one of the things that I've seen people do that is less effective is to find a program they really like. So they find a module, they find a resource they like, and they use it every year. And so the people who've been there for 2, 3, 4, 5 years, right, they see it as, oh, we're doing this again. So the trick is to really look at multiple resources and multiple tools and keep scanning. Ask your colleagues, what are you using? What do you like? Trade information. Maybe you've got something that you found that they would use, so that you're constantly getting different resources and different points of view. Keep that fresh. And I think that phrase that Kimberly used, moving toward, right? You don't just go to this training and all of a sudden you're self-aware. Right? You're more self-aware, I hope, at the end of it, but that's a journey. And so you have to keep at it, keep working at it.
So along the same lines, in terms of kind of that annual review, certainly it's important to review your practices. And so I mentioned earlier, where are you recruiting? And again, what is the dynamic? What's the dynamic of that particular high school? Have things changed over time that you need to make note of? So where are you recruiting? Are you utilizing virtual outreach, certainly coming out of COVID? And, as we continue to deal with COVID and the different variants, virtual, I think, is going to be around for a while. And so are we utilizing the virtual outreach, and to what extent? Are we engaging with parents? Parents continue to be an integral part of the process. And for some cultures, they're even more involved. And so again, are we engaging in parents and working with them and bringing them along and including them in the process? Community organizations, to what extent are we reaching out, and are we partnering with churches, civic groups, LGBTQ plus support organizations? And where do underrepresented groups live? And so again, looking at the data, county census data, high school data, community college fact books and data resources, to really have a true sense of where populations are, and to, again, not go on historical assumptions, not to assume that a particular city or a particular town has some percent of underrepresented students. You need to verify that and really dig into the data to make sure that that is still the case, year to year. And then how does your enrollment compare to the areas you serve? And so again, really understanding your institutional mission, and again, how does that connect with where you are and who you serve? And so again, making sure that you've covered all of those bases, and so you can say with confidence that you are doing your level best to reach out and to provide access to students for whom you draw students. So tools for the toolbox. So I mentioned earlier the Toolbox reference that report in 1999, and we continue to look at our toolbox and what kinds of things do we need to have in our toolbox. And so a couple of things as it relates to cost. And so certainly as we're reaching out to students and families, we want to make sure that we make clear the true cost of college attendance after financial aid. So again, kind of those out-of-pocket costs after everything's been taken into consideration. If we can all, if possible, reduce the cost of applying. And so you'll see on this slide, these are some application fees from 2016. But again, pretty pricey. And as Tom's point earlier, $90 may not seem like a lot, but to some families, it could be $9,000. So again, it's relative, and it's something that people should kind of keep in mind. Ensure that the language and the marketing material is inclusive. And that just happens with a review and with some intentionality in terms of making sure that that material is inclusive. And then also the evaluation, evaluating applications, recognizing the barriers that some students have already overcome. So again, just that awareness piece. So these are things that should be in everyone's toolkit.
Those are such great points. And I think the point even about just applying to your institution, and some people in the webinar today may have no application fee, but for those that do, how hard do you make it to get a fee waiver? How much do you make a student declare they're unable to pay you? What kind of documentation do you require? And why do we do that? Why do we not accept at face value that if someone's asking for help, that we offer them help with it, rather than having them fill out a College Board waiver or getting a letter from a counselor, something like that. Those things can often just be embarrassing, and they're just barriers. They're barriers to your institution. They're barriers to you reaching the students that you're trying to serve. Great. So let's think also about our admission requirements. And over time, admissions requirements have been different things. So they definitely started as ways to screen students out of higher education. And remember, higher education has historically been inequitable and discriminatory. And there are just centuries of evidence of that. We don't need to go into the details of that here because it's just so profound. And it's become more and more equitable over time. But we need to also really think about those ways that they've come into existence and exist today. And so when there were far too many people for the seats that were in there, you needed some way to identify those who were able to get in the best of the best, the cream of the crop with it, often the most advantaged students. Now, they're really designed to help us identify students who can thrive in our educational environment. And they're always going to be inexact. So you're always going to miss at some level with your admissions requirements because there are going to be students who are really, really capable, who can really do the work, but aren't evidencing that through the traditional means that you've required for them to evidence this. And also, there are just things like essays, right? And so when we think about that, the most advantaged students have the most resources for essays. They can have people coach them. They can have people check them. So you really need to think about that. Why do you have admissions requirements the way you do today? What's the function of those admissions requirements? If it's to really help you identify students who can thrive in your educational environment, are they really serving that purpose? And also, I said they were inexact. We all know they're also inexact on the other end. There are some students who have really high test scores and really great GPAs who don't have the motivation and come to your institution and are gone in a semester with a 0.5 GPA. So if we think that admissions requirements are somehow this sacrosanct entity that can't be changed, think again, because their sole function is to help us identify the right students for our institution. And we have to think about that a little bit harder. If we're using test scores without any context with them, then that kind of formulaic, GPA plus this ACT or SAT score equals with it, we are definitely going to be missing out on some really great students. And you just shouldn't over rely on test scores. They need to be balanced in the criteria that you're using. And of course, whenever possible, you want to look for additional factors if you know really what you're looking for in those additional factors. In COVID, we kind of raced to holistic practices, and there was a lot of, I would say, discussion and a lot of press in our own field about, people going test optional. And somehow that equated with some greater equity. But, the question isn't whether or not the test was making it inequitable or not inequitable. Let's take that out of the equation. What makes a more equitable review system then? What's a more equitable way to look at students if you're not using tests? And unfortunately, there's far too little research and rigor applied to file review. When you start to jump into holistic, a lot of people think, well, we read the whole application, or we asked for an essay. And so do you know what you're reading for? What are the qualities that you're actually trying to gain? And are you doing that consistently from case to case? Or are you giving the nod to the student who tells the best story? And so when you do that, you have to really think about establishing an equitable holistic practice for review. You need to have rubrics, and they need to be consistently applied. And I'll tell you, training, 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 training. You have to train your staff on how to read the files equitably and consistently, and how to read to a rubric so they know what they're reading for, and they're pulling that information out to try and identify those characteristics of students that you can't find in a transcript and you couldn't get from a test score. So bias can easily creep into the review process, and my fear is that as we rush to go to holistic and away from tests, we might actually wind up with less equitable systems of review. So you have to be very, very cautious when you think about holistic as a mechanism to improve equity. It could wind up having the opposite effect.
If I could just briefly add, related, I do think that it's important, at least in my experience, to also make sure that if it's a staffing issue in terms of being able to take the time and to have the number of staff needed to do it correctly, it's worth that investment. And so again, from a resource standpoint, when you have to make decisions, this could be an area where you really think strategically, is this a place where there may need to be an additional investment to do it in a way that meets really what we're hoping to. And so there is a resource component that sometimes is worth giving an extra consideration to.
Excellent. Yeah, totally agree. And of course, marketing and messaging. Now, I think most of us have become a little bit better attuned to this, but I review a bunch of websites, and And I still see things that out there that I don't think people have thought through completely when they're putting together their visual imagery and their messaging. This is where our students are getting their first impression of us and that first sense of belonging or not. So where do your analytics tell you, if you look at your Google Analytics, where are your prospective students going? What pages are they visiting? Start with those pages first. And make sure that they're authentic, that they really represent your student body. And if they're inauthentic, it's of little value to you to have that, because once the student comes to your campus and sees something very different than what they see there, that won't work. Also, students are really smart these days about all these visual images. And I've seen this happen. I'm sure you've heard it too, that students go to a website or they go through publications and they see the same 3 students of color in all the photos where students of color appear, and they get it, right? They're like, oh, this place is trying to show us that they have diversity, but it looks like they just planted these 3 students in all these photos with it. And that's going to come off as very inauthentic, and it's actually going to work against you in really trying to establish that with students that this is a place they may want to explore further. And then think about your events. Think about the times when you have students coming to campus or you're going to somebody's campus to do an event, and you're going to have a panel. Who's on that panel, right? Can students see themselves in that group that's there? And are your counselors trained to talk about diversity or give presentations or answer questions on it when they're out in the field? Because we hope that that's going to be a topic that people may want to ask about and talk about with it. What kind of place is this like for, my child who's not like, what seems to be most of the kids going to higher education today? What's your campus like? What are your counselors going to say when they're out there in the field and answering those questions? Okay. We've covered an awful lot about the front door, but we need to really make sure we're covering the success, completion, persistence of the students and closing those very long-standing gaps in equity that we've seen in higher education. So Kimberly, please.
Yeah. So once again, I'll kick us off by just sharing some data to make sure that we all are on the same page. So again, looking at National Student Clearinghouse Research Center, about 30% of students who entered college in 2014, in the fall of 2014, did not return the second year, right? Of the 45% of students who start and fail to complete their degree, less than a quarter are dismissed for poor academic performance. And so most leave for other reasons. And so again, this is according to Q, who's done a lot of work on high impact practices. And so again, that's an important piece of data to keep in mind. And then lastly, only about 35% of first-time full-time college students who plan to earn a bachelor's degree reach that goal within 4 years. 56% achieve it within 6 years. And so those are just some interesting statistics to keep in mind as we really dive into persistence here. The changing student profile, we've obviously have seen changes in our demographics, but also in the number of students who are first generation college students. And so it's important to keep in mind that the first generation college student population is comprised of students from historically disadvantaged groups. And so those include students of color, students from low socioeconomic backgrounds, and students from immigrant families. And so this infographic on the screen, you can kind of see just what the demographic looks like in terms of the first generation students today, the percent that are female, that are Black or brown, that are poor. The one other piece that I wanted to note about first generation students, and Tom, I don't know if you've seen this as well, but students who are first generation students don't always have the same social networks compared to students that are non-first generation. And they often rely more on college and university support structures. And so again, there are a lot of important things to keep in mind in terms of first generation students as it relates to persistence. I just wanted to highlight, again, we talk about the gaps where here you can actually see gaps in degree completion by demographics, our white students, Black and Latino. You can see what those percentages look like, and you can certainly see that there remains a gap between white students, Black students, and Latino students. So one thing that I wanted to point out and to really was to highlight is that, we talk about the gaps and closing the gaps. And so it's important to realize that there's some demographics that are growing very quickly, and our Hispanic Americans are fall in that category. They are fast growing and historically have had lower average college attendance in the past. And so again, when we talk about closing the gaps and kind of having some goals and milestones to really reach our goals in terms of college attainment by 2030, our Latina students will need to earn about 6.2 million more degrees. Again, so trying to take some of the data and really put it in context in terms of the challenges ahead of us. Now, many of you have probably read and have heard about what happened with COVID as it relates to FAFSA filing. And so certainly wanted to point out that this is an area that we'll continue to keep an eye on in terms of equity and closing those equity gaps. And so what we've noticed and what's been reported is that more than 250,000 fewer students applied for financial aid during the pandemic. And this decline was almost 4 times higher in schools where more than half of the students were Black and Hispanic. And so again, just some trends that really jumped out to me and are trends that we'll continue to monitor as we kind of come out of the pandemic, but recognizing that this is something that happened that, again, is going to cause some challenges potentially down the road.
When you listen to the news maybe at night or you hear somebody say something, the pandemic was, especially inequitable, right? Well, what does that mean, right? And here you see just some real evidence of the ways in which the pandemic was less equitable for people of color than others. And so we know that there are impacts of this that we'll have to recover from over the next several years, or try to recover from over the next several years.
Absolutely.
So we wanted to spend just a few minutes here. We might do these somewhat quickly so we can get to Q&A, but we just want to make sure with every webinar that we do, we leave you with some things that are going to help you when you get off the webinar or see this deck as a resource that you can really have some tools, right? Some things to take back and start to think about. And when I think about retention, it almost becomes so overwhelming, right? All the different things. I always like to have a frame in which I can hang things. And one of the things I like to do is hang it into Tintos' theory of student departure, his model of student departure, where he had these 5 big areas. And you could have different areas with it, but to me it's a helpful way to at least start to think about, well, when we think about equity gaps and closing those, how do we examine each of these and start to think about it through the lens of Tintos' model? So the first place where he had this is academic integration. And Kimberly, you already mentioned that for first generation students, right, there's some differences here. And one of those is you're really thinking about the ways in which they view academic programs and college in general. That investment of time, that investment of money is, am I going into something that's going to return something? How do I understand that return on my investment? And so it's that clear linkage and information on how the academic careers prepare you for jobs, or academic programs prepare you for careers and jobs, tongue-tied too. And I think that this is not just about picking those that are really already kind of obvious, like nursing, for example, but what about history? What are the ways in which a history degree prepares you for a great career? What about psychology? What about these programs that have had lower enrollment? Part of that reason is that more first-generation students are going to college and they're less able to see that linkage between. They need to see it. The other is to think about when we make the leap from our secondary school to our college environment, we're making a leap of learning. We knew how to learn in high school, and we have to learn how to learn in college. And so that often means that we're placing students into remedial courses because they didn't have the right test score or the right placement score. And what happens is that's very demotivating for students, and it can just extend their time to degree. It gets more expensive, etc. And so really most of the recommendations now are to go to co-requisite rather than remedial models. We talked about the climate and social integration is another one of Tintos' areas. Peer mentoring can be very effective. Because students of any age, right, don't often want to talk to administrators in suits, but they're more likely to ask the important questions. The real barriers can be questions they're asking their peers and asking for advice. They're probably going to do that anyway, but what if you had a trained group of students that were really ready to answer those questions, better able to answer those questions, and knew how to refer someone to services to really help them? So peer mentoring is a great way to think about that. And also just thinking about the spaces, right, and the groups that students can be at. Things like the Male Success Alliance, Black Students Alliance, Indigenous People Spaces and Houses. Canada has some amazing resources for Indigenous peoples. And just look at some of those and look at the ways in which we're really trying to make sure that people can feel comfortable and they can feel like there are ways that they can socialize and be accepted and be supported as students at your institution. Financial support's another big one, and some of these may be obvious, but moving towards need-based aid. If you have merit aid at your institution, most places do today, and making sure it's not overly skewed towards merit aid, that just reinforces advantage. And so you want to make sure you have a good balance of need-based and merit-based aid, because that merit-based aid may help you land some very highly qualified students. Need-based aid is going to help all your students stay enrolled, and that's going to really help all students with equity gaps. And remember, when we're thinking about renewal criteria for scholarships, don't always tie them to academic performance. I can't tell you how many places I've seen that tie grants, not scholarships, but grants, to a certain GPA they have to attain. Why do we do that? Don't we just want the student to be able to afford to enroll? How about just using good standing as that, and then be willing to make exceptions even if the student's on probation for a semester? You don't want to lose the student, and we're creating policy barriers that really have no sound reasoning for them. They just sounded good when we made up the criteria. Next one's goal clarity. And this means that a student can see a clear reason why they're in college. And this is especially important for first-generation students, because remember, they might have less of an understanding and a social network, as Kimberly mentioned, to help them navigate the college environment. And so, help them with career choices. Many first-generation students may be under unusual pressure or more pressure than others to pick majors that align with clear jobs. But it may not mean that's what they really want to do or what they're really good at. And so helping them find those resources and having people to talk to and training your advisors about that is really important. Helping them feel okay to be undeclared or exploring a major may be a really important resource. And then for all your students that are coming through that may be low SES, students of color, etc., what's the support of family and friends for them to be at your institution? How easy is it for them to be there? They may have needs of getting back home to help care for other family members. There may be a small business that the family's running. They may be needed to provide income into the household to keep all the bills paid. And so they may have extra activities that they need to do that aren't joining clubs and organizations. Do they feel like they're a part of your community when they have these other things that pull them away, back home, back to their community for those? And making sure that we're really clearly communicating with parents and providing them with information and communications. Well, that was a quick race through Tintos Model. So these will again be in the resources. But Kimberly, do you want to say just a few words about
briefly
about this? Yeah,
absolutely. I mean, I think just to tie things up, just broadly about persistence and support, it's certainly critical to think about the emotional and other support students need. Mental health support, that's a key area to make sure that there's some awareness and that we're attuned to the needs of our students regarding the mental health support that they'll need. And then really to ask the questions, where's your institution strongly positioned, right? And then where are the deficits, and where are the areas for improvement? I think ultimately those are two critical questions that are always helpful to just take a step back and to really answer honestly, where are you positioned? And I think that provides a great opportunity to then go forward and to help advance and to help, again, close some of the equity gaps that exist currently.
Kimberly, you found this great visual here that is such a wonderful last slide for us to really think about all these things that contribute to student success. And so if you're looking for lenses or areas for exploration, to me, when I saw this, when you brought this forward, I thought, boy, every one of these things, right? I want to drill into every one of these things. What are we doing? How are
Yeah.
we addressing these things? Are we strongly positioned in these, or are these deficits that we need to think about?
Yeah, I agree.
So we're just going to go through and we're ready for Q&A. And just to let you know, this is what's in the deck. We promised some resources on climate, some resources on cultural competence. Also, we've got some things coming up at the SEM conference. I'll do a little commercial here in a second for that. But don't forget about the book that Michelle Sandlin just edited and put together on the non-cognitive variable use in holistic admissions, with case studies of very different institutions and how they went about moving to holistic practices. We also have an ACRO work group report on gender identity expression, and you can link to that. And that's an excellent guide to how your systems, even your applications, what kind of things do you do or not do in trying to make a really welcoming environment for students where gender identity may not be as clear and simple as male-female. And then all these wonderful references that you can dive into and look at different things here. No shortage of different things that you can go into here. And last but not least, as we get to Q&A, just want to make sure you remember that SEM's coming up in Miami. We're going to do it in person. I'm kind of excited to be back in person. It is in Florida, and a lot of people go, "Oh my gosh, Florida!" But realize that Miami-Dade County and the areas around that are some of the most vaccinated counties in the United States. They're over 80% vaccination for ages 12 and older. So, if you're thinking, "Oh my gosh, why would I go there?" Realize that where we're going to be in Florida is quite different than other parts of the state. But we've got a SEM Institute. Great plenaries, great panels. Greg Fowler, the new president of Global Campus, is going to be our Sunday night keynote. Great networking, the team experience, et cetera, et cetera. So with that, Mike, did we have any questions or comments in the chat floating in that we should address?
Hey, Tom, thanks. So in the chat, there was a question around resources that might be available for cultural competence. And I saw in the slide deck, there are some literature references in there, but I'm not sure if you're, I guess, prepared to expand on what might be out there for people to take a look at.
Kimberly, do you want to talk a little bit about that?
Yeah, I mean, I've referenced one particular resource that I use. I've had an opportunity to teach diversity issues in human services counseling. And this is a text that I've used. Again, it's dated, but it's core and it has some real core concepts. And so I do think that either this particular text, there are others. And as Tom said, there's certainly opportunities to scan and to see what else is available. But in my teaching, this is the one in particular that I have found to be helpful and useful. So, and again, there are others.
Great. Other questions, comments that we can discuss, or if the group would like to have a discussion? Did we get something popping in the Q&A?
Yep. So this is from Anonymous. In Florida, we have a performance-based state funding model. Historically, funding is based on total enrollment. How can we address the equality gap in that model?
So a funding model based on total enrollment, right?
That's correct.
Yeah, and so when you think about that, it means bigger is better, right? I think that's a win-win from my perspective. I'll let you also comment on this, Kimberly, but to me, this is the future. Our demographics are definitely moving in the direction of a Black and brown America. And so when we think about those schools where say 60% of the students have always been white, right? Which is still, that's quite a diverse student body at a lot of campuses today in America. When we think about that, the opportunity is if we're going to grow, we're not going to grow by having more white advantaged students. That's not the demographics. The demographics clearly point to growth being people of color, the black and brown community, our Native American community. Those are the areas where America is growing. So if your funding model is based upon that, actually this is an opportunity by achieving greater access and enrollment success. So it's not just getting students to come there, but actually keeping them enrolled. That's the way you're going to grow your enrollment. And if your funding formula is based upon total enrollment, getting good at this is also going to help you be rewarded by that funding model. Kimberly, any thoughts on that?
Yeah, I completely agree. And I think the only thing I would add in my experience is that I do think when coming up with enrollment plans, and I understand that there's certainly goals and targets that have to be met. But again, I think trying to think to make sure that we're not falling into old habits and just continuing to do the same thing and not taking an opportunity to say, is there a different market? Is there something else that we could do? And so I do think they're planning, they're plans that can be put forward that can accomplish both. And I do think just trying not to fall into old patterns, old habits in terms of trying to reach enrollment goals, but to make sure that you take some time to kind of take a step back and to make sure that you aren't missing any opportunities and you're just not relying on kind of old habits, if you will.
Great.
And just to clarify there, so they used to be in Florida get funding based on total enrollment. So it is now that they are in a performance-based state funding model.
Oh, sure. You know what? Yeah, and that's a different issue because
Yeah.
and I think Alicia Moore from Central Oregon Community College did her doctoral dissertation on this. That what can happen is that you can then start to, because if it's performance based, like retention, completion rates are higher, right? Your temptation might be to exclude the students who are more at risk with it. And so that can, yes, that's a very different issue. Sorry. But that one is one where you have to get good at this, right? This implores you to get good at this because if you don't figure this out, what are your options, right? Your options are less funding, or it's to just have more students of advantage, which is a decreasing body of students in the United States, and you're missing all these other students. I think, beyond for me, it's a moral thing, but I think you just have to really become very adept at this in order to really survive in that kind of performance-based funding model. Yeah.
Great. And so we got a few more questions, and I know we don't have a ton of time left. There's one that came in the chat there as well, but I'll start with Michael's. How do you assess individual performance when it comes to success in closing equity gaps?
Kimberly, do you want to start with that one? I'll come in second.
Well, I think so. You mean, I don't know. My read on it is individual in terms of at a particular institution. And, are there things that can be done, at that level to close gaps? And certainly, I think that's where there is a lot of opportunity to within your kind of sphere of influence is what Tom's talked about, what gaps can be closed at a particular institution, at that point. But that's my thinking. And I do think there are lots that can be done. And certainly I've had the pleasure of doing that at a couple of institutions. It's hard work. Certainly you have to really dig in on data, but it can be done. Tom, I don't know if you want to add anything.
Yeah, I think a couple of points there. I think when you look at the macro level of closing equity gaps, that's on the enrollment manager, right? That's that person's responsibility to not only identify them, but to measure them, to start closing them, along with a whole bunch of other metrics that you're accountable for as an enrollment manager. I think that's individually, performance measure. As we get into staff and start to think about those equity gaps, I'm not sure that it's something where you say, oh my gosh, your job is, being yay or nay on this, but I think you begin to, talk with your counselors if they're recruiting about what's your area. Here, we've asked you to serve this territory. And so here's this territory, here's the population of this territory, here's our expectation of trying to close equity gaps. What are you doing about that? What's your plan for that? Are you developing a plan for that? How are we helping you develop a plan for that? Are you executing the plan? Are you getting the results from that plan? I think that's a perfectly appropriate lens through which to look at performance review in closing equity gaps. Is you have to put it on the list of things that you're trying to do and the goals that you're trying to achieve through your recruitment with it, and then you have to just work with people to get better at it and hold them accountable. Yeah.
Great, thanks for the answers there. So we got a few more questions. We're technically at 3 p.m. right now. I'm not exactly sure what your status is as far as upcoming meetings.
I can hang on for a few more minutes.
And I was going to say, we don't have any significant attendee drop off. I think we've only lost 2. So say we do at least one more. There's I guess this is more of a question maybe for its own webinar in the question box there. It seems we also need to address equity gaps and issues in our own offices and institutions as well if we want to make a real difference for students. How can we make this work sustainable over the long haul, as we know it isn't a quick fix?
Mm-hmm. Yeah. I'll start that one because I know some macro research that we've done about our professions, which is really eye-opening. So, for example, we know that a lot of people who enter the professions, registrar, admissions, or enrollment services, when we look at the racial ethnic diversity of that group, we see it's a very diverse group of people who enter the field. When we get to the management level, when we get to the director level, the VP level, it's not, right? And so there's a gap there, there's a loss there, something's happening in between there. And I think for me, a couple of things that I've always tried to do with that to address it, you have to work to get people to the decision-making table. Mm-hmm. Right? It's not enough to get them employed or get them started with it, but what's the path? What's the professional development path for people that's going to get them to the decision-making table? That's where the difference comes. Mm-hmm. And so if we're only saying that we're hiring and we're promoting, those are good, right? Don't get me wrong, those are good things to do, but until you get people at the decision-making table in your executive team, your management team with it, you haven't come all the way. And so I think it's really important that we have to close those equity gaps by working to get people who are underrepresented in our institutional administration to the level where they can be at the decision-making table and continue to work with them to do that. Kimberly?
I agree. I don't think I'd have anything else to add. I think you nailed it.
Great answer there. Then going to Marissa, this is a little more specific. What suggestions would you have for universities that do not collect race-based or ethnicity data? For example, Canadian universities don't do this well yet anyway. The first 3 potential climate dimensions are difficult to inventory.
Yeah, they sure are. And I've worked with a number of Canadian institutions, and it's been a really interesting discussion that we've had in the Canadian universities and colleges on this, in that they collect one piece, right? They collect is on Indigenous peoples. And so they can act upon that, and of course they should act upon that in order to, Truth and Reconciliation calls them to do that in Canada. That's, not only a movement, but it's actually law. And so that's part of it where they can. The other institutions with which I've worked that are trying to tackle that are looking at 2 different things to try and address this. One is a survey of their current students that'd be voluntary, to try and collect some voluntary data from their students. By the way, all of our information in the U.S. is voluntary. It's never required that you disclose your ethnicity, we've just been doing it for so long that everybody, they're so used to having it asked on all these questionnaires that they don't usually think twice on it. Probably a long way to go in Canada before you can really do that. But some voluntary surveys are a way to start to see just what the levels are, and even if you can get a good sampling of your student body, to be able to start with that at least allows you to know where you're at. And then you can kind of look out there at the rest of your communities across Canada, Stats Canada, some other resources there can start to gather that. But it is a real challenge, and the desire is just as strong in Canada to close these equity gaps as it is here in the US. It's just that we've been collecting this data since the Civil Rights Act of 1964 as a way to try and measure whether or not we're closing some of those gaps or not. Yeah.
Great. And then the last question there is from Jessica, and she asks, what suggestions would you have for institutions seeking to address equity gaps in admissions for graduate level studies, master's, PhD, etc.?
So again, I'll give a first answer, and Kimberly jump in on this one. So I think part of when you look at the gap that Kimberly showed you in graduates of color over graduates or completion rates, right, of white students, we can already see that we're already starting to limit our pool because we're not graduating as many of those students, or not as high rates for those students. So I think part of that to me for graduate is making sure that you're kind of oversampling, if you will, where you recruit your graduate students, creating relationships with HBCUs, HSIs, tribal colleges, so that you're actively recruiting and knowing that you want to recruit their graduates. It can be competitive, right? There's no doubt about that, that there are a lot of graduate programs that are trying to have greater diversity, and you may not have as many stipends or as many assistantships as another institution might, but don't get out hustled, right? Don't be beaten on effort at that, and you really need to make sure that it's where you're recruiting and have as many resources as you possibly can. I think all the other things at the undergraduate about climate, I think about training, I think about cultural competence, all those equally apply at the graduate level.
Yeah, I completely agree. I agree with everything you've said. And I do know that there's been a little movement in terms of looking at standardized test scores also as a requirement for some graduate programs, and at least a revisiting of that. And so again, that could be something to explore, again, in the context of trying to determine a student's preparedness and whether or not a test is required and how that factors in. So that'd be the only other thing I'd add.
Great. Well, then you guys have addressed all of the questions. Just a few minutes past the hour, but we appreciate you both sticking with us, and for all the attendees that are still here.
Thank you, Mike. Pleased to be here. And thanks everybody for being such an attentive audience. And Kimberly, thank you for being such a great co-presenter as always.
Thank you. It was a lot of fun. Thank you so much. I'll see you guys in Miami.
Yep. Bye, everybody. Have a good weekend.
All right. Thank you. Bye-bye.